Let her go. I said let her go right now. The scream tore through the perfumed air of the Thorne mansion like a blade, rattling the massive windows overlooking Lake Michigan. No greetings, no composure, only pure, unbridled rage. In the center of the luxurious living room where golden sunset light usually bathed the mahogany furniture and priceless artwork, a nightmare was unfolding. Victoria Ashford, in her blood-red designer dress clinging perfectly to her statuesque figure, had completely lost control. Her face, usually magazine-perfect, now contorted with an almost feral fury, her manicured finger pointing like a loaded weapon toward the center of the room, her long crimson nails trembling with the intensity of her wrath. Facing her, standing like a wall of flesh and bone, was Nora Sullivan. The young caregiver had no jewelry, no designer clothes, no arrogance of Victoria, wearing only her simple navy blue uniform pressed immaculately with white collar and apron contrasting against her pale skin marked by years of exhaustion. But in this moment, Nora looked like a giant. She wasn't backing down, wasn't lowering her head, her feet planted firmly on the Persian rug, her arms wrapped protectively around a fragile, trembling body. Margaret Thorne, the woman who'd once ruled the Chicago underworld alongside her husband, who'd ordered executions and hosted senators, now resembled a frightened sparrow wrapped in an oversized gray cardigan that hung loose on her bony shoulders. Her eyes were wide and lost in the fog of Alzheimer's, looking at Victoria, not as her future daughter-in-law, but as a monster emerging from the shadows. Her age-spotted hands, thin as paper, clutched desperately at Nora's apron with the strength of someone drowning who'd found a lifeline. "You savage!" Victoria hissed again, taking a threatening step forward, her Louboutin heels striking the oak floor with a sound sharp as gunfire. "You dare put your hands on her. I'll destroy you." Nora tightened her embrace around Margaret, feeling the old woman's heart hammering against her own chest, rapid and erratic like a trapped rabbit. "Ma'am, please step back." Nora spoke. Her voice didn't tremble, didn't shout, but carried an edge of steel that no one in this house expected from the new girl. "You're terrifying her. Can't you see she's petrified? Step back now. You're ordering me in my own house." Victoria released a laugh of disbelief that sounded more like hysteria than humor. "You're nobody. You're the help. You're trash that Kieran picked up from the gutter." Victoria raised her hand, ready to tear Margaret from Nora's arms, ready to impose her hierarchy by force. Nora turned her body, offering her scarred back to receive the blow if necessary, shielding the old woman completely. The air grew thick with electricity, heavy and suffocating. The visual contrast was violent. Victoria's aggressive red and bronzed skin against Nora's serene blue and defensive stance. Wealth against dignity, cruelty against compassion. At that precise moment when Victoria's hand hung suspended in the air, and Nora closed her eyes awaiting impact, the heavy front door swung open with a thunderous echo through the marble foyer. Footsteps, heavy and authoritative, resonated across the stone floor. Kieran Thorne had arrived. The man appeared beneath the archway leading to the living room, freezing in place. He wore a three-piece charcoal suit tailored to perfection, his steel-gray eyes betraying deep exhaustion after 12 hours of negotiations with rival families. His dark hair showed silver at the temples. His jaw was clenched tight. He'd sought silence, sought whiskey, sought his mother's smile. Instead, he'd found a war. His sharp, analytical eyes scanned the scene in a fraction of a second. He saw his fiancée, the woman he was to marry in 2 months, with her face twisted in rage and her hand raised high. He saw the new caregiver, the young woman the agency had sent just 1 week ago, cornered against the cold fireplace. And he saw his mother hiding behind the help, trembling and emitting a low, constant whimper that froze the blood in his veins. The silence following Kieran's entrance was more deafening than all the screaming before. Victoria froze mid-motion, her expression transforming in milliseconds from pure fury to the mask of a startled victim. Nora lifted her gaze, her green eyes meeting Kieran's gray ones. There was no pleading in her look, only a defiant steadiness. "What the hell's going on here?" Kieran asked, his voice low but carrying the force of distant thunder announcing a devastating storm. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, his presence filling the space, radiating an authority that made the very air seem to stop. "I demand an explanation right now. If this story touches your soul, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what happens next. Your support means everything to us. Now let's go back to the moment everything satisfies." Victoria was the first to react. With a skill worthy of an Oscar, her aggressive posture collapsed in an instant. Her shoulders slumped. The hand that had been raised high dropped and then flew to her chest as if she were the one who had just been attacked, and the eyes that moments earlier had been spitting venom now shimmered with perfectly formed tears. "Kieran," she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. "Oh my God, thank heaven you're home." Victoria rushed toward him but stopped halfway, pretending to be too shocked to move, breathing hard in an exaggerated display. "It's horrific. Truly horrific. I've never felt so threatened in my life." Kieran frowned, the mind of a boss accustomed to analyzing situations, struggling to process the conflicting signals before him. He looked toward Nora, who still stood motionless, her hand gently stroking his mother's white hair, whispering words no one else could hear to soothe her. "Threatened," Kieran repeated, his voice hardening. "Victoria, explain this. Why were you screaming like that? Why is my mother shaking?" Victoria took a deep breath, swallowed loudly, and pointed at Nora with a finger now trembling in a carefully staged way. "Because I arrived just in time to save her," she shouted. "I went into the living room because I heard noise, and I saw her, this wild creature." Victoria paused dramatically, lifting a hand to cover her mouth as if what she was about to say were too painful to utter. "She was shaking her, Kieran, shaking your mother." She was screaming in her face, forcing her to take her medicine faster because she wanted to finish early. She was abusing her right in front of me. Silence fell over the room like lead. The accusation was too severe to ignore. Kieran felt a wave of heat rise up his neck. Harming his mother was his greatest fear. The reason he had fired 5 nurses in 2 years. The reason he had installed cameras throughout the house that he rarely had time to review. He turned slowly toward Nora, his gray eyes darkening with a mix of disappointment and restrained fury. "Is that true?" he asked the employee. He didn't shout, but the coldness in his voice was more terrifying than any scream. It was the voice of a powerful man accustomed to destroying anyone who dared touch those he loved. Nora lifted her head, her green eyes meeting Kieran's icy gray ones. She didn't bow, didn't tremble, didn't beg. "No, sir." Her voice was so calm it was almost cold. "I was protecting her from her." Victoria screamed, her voice shrill with outrage. "Do you hear that, Kieran? She even dares to accuse me. She's insane. She not only abused your mother, but now she's trying to blame me. A servant, a nobody, daring to accuse the daughter of Senator Ashford." Margaret, in Nora's arms, suddenly let out a small sob. In the panic of her Alzheimer's, she called Nora by another name. "Emily," she whispered, her voice like a passing breeze. "Emily, don't let her come near you. She hurts you. She pinches you." Kieran froze. Emily, his sister's name, the sister who had died 11 years earlier right in front of him. His heart felt as if it were being crushed, but Victoria rushed in, twisting the meaning of those words. "You see," she said, her voice heavy with false compassion, "your mother is delirious, because that girl terrified her. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's calling Emily's name because she's traumatized by the abuse from this girl." Kieran looked at his mother, at the way she clung to Nora, as if the young woman were her only lifeline. A part of him sensed that something was wrong. But the fear of losing his mother, the fear that had haunted him since the day Emily died, clouded his reason. Victoria stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm, her voice gentle yet dripping with poison. "You have to send her away right now, Kieran, before she hurts your mother again. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to her. I love her like my own mother." And Kieran, the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago, the man who had killed without hesitation, believed her. He believed the lie wrapped in tears and counterfeit concern. He believed the wrong person. Kieran nodded slowly, the decision already made in his mind. He stepped toward Nora, each footfall heavy as lead, his gray eyes now as cold as a Chicago winter. He didn't look at her, unwilling to see anything that might make him waver. "Get out of my house," Kieran said, his voice low and even, like a funeral bell. "Right now. If I see you within a mile of this place, you'll understand why people call me the devil." Victoria couldn't fully hide the flash of triumph in her eyes, but she masked it quickly behind a display of false concern. She tightened her grip on Kieran's arm as if seeking comfort, though in truth she was savoring her victory. Nora remained still. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't drop to her knees like so many others had before Kieran Thorne. Instead, she gently pried Margaret's trembling fingers from her apron, bent down to the older woman's eye level, and whispered something no one else could hear. Margaret shook her head wildly, her frail hands trying to cling to Nora, her mouth forming meaningless sounds in panic. "I'll go," Nora said, her voice so calm it surprised even Kieran. She straightened, facing the mafia boss without a trace of fear. But before I leave, I have one request. You have no right to ask for anything. Victoria cut in sharply. You're an abuser. You should be grateful Kieran isn't calling the police. Nora ignored Victoria completely, her green eyes fixed only on Kieran. Please check the security cameras, she said, every word clear and steady. See what really happened in this house before you place your full trust in anyone. The air in the room suddenly felt thick. Victoria went pale for an instant, then forced herself back into composure. Kieran, don't listen to her, Victoria said, her voice carrying a haste that hadn't been there before. She's stalling, trying to escape blame. You saw with your own eyes how frightened your mother was. Why would you need to check the cameras? Kieran looked at Victoria, then at Nora. There was something in the young woman's calm that unsettled him. The guilty usually panicked, pleaded, scrambled for excuses. Nora didn't. She stood there like someone innocent, waiting for the truth to surface. I don't need to check the cameras, Kieran finally said, his voice cold. I trust Victoria. Take her out. 2 bodyguards stepped forward, each gripping one of Nora's arms. She didn't resist, allowing them to lead her away. But as she was pulled past the living room doorway, Margaret suddenly let out a heartbreaking scream. No! Her cry echoed through the room, raw with pain and despair. Emily, don't go. Don't let her throw you out. Don't leave me. Kieran froze. For the second time that day, his mother had spoken Emily's name, the name of his sister who had died. And this time, she was calling the maid by that name. As she struggled to rise from the sofa and follow Nora, Nora stopped and turned back, looking at Margaret one last time. She'll be all right, Nora said, her voice breaking for the first time since everything began. I promise. Even if I'm not here, she'll be all right. Then she was taken away, disappearing behind the door. Margaret sobbed, curling into herself on the sofa, calling Emily's name again and again. Victoria tried to approach to comfort her, but Margaret screamed in terror and recoiled as if Victoria were a venomous snake. Kieran stood in the middle of the living room, watching his mother shrink away from the woman he intended to marry. A small doubt began to stir inside him, but he pushed it aside. He had made his decision. He couldn't be wrong. Yet deep in his subconscious, Nora's words echoed like a curse. Please check the security cameras. Stop. The voice came from the doorway, low and commanding in a different way. Raymond Donovan stepped into the living room, tall and lean, yet carrying the quiet authority of a man who had seen too many rises and falls to be impressed by power alone. He had served the Thorne family for 40 years, since Kieran's father was still alive, and he was one of the very few men who could look a mafia boss in the eye without fear. I ordered her removed. Raymond, Kieran said, a warning threaded through his voice. You don't have the authority to interfere. Raymond didn't flinch. He walked to the center of the room, positioning himself between Kieran and the door through which Nora had just been taken. Sir, I've served this family for 40 years. I've kept silent about many things. I've buried secrets even you don't know. But today, I can't stay silent. Victoria cut in sharply, irritation lacing her tone. Who is this old man to speak to Kieran like that? This is family business. It has nothing to do with servants. Raymond turned his gaze on Victoria, his eyes cold as ice. I'm not speaking to you, Miss Ashford. I'm speaking to the son of the woman I swore to protect with my life. He faced Kieran again, his voice softer but unyielding. Margaret is like a sister to me. I held you in my arms the day you were born. I stood beside you at your father's funeral, and at Emily's funeral. And if you dismiss that girl without checking the cameras, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Kieran clenched his jaw. No one spoke to him like that. No one dared. But Raymond was different. Raymond was the last man from his father's era, the one who had taught him how to hold a gun for the first time, the one who had held him when Emily stopped breathing in his arms. I've made my decision, Raymond, Kieran said, though his voice wasn't as certain as before. Victoria seized the moment. Exactly. He's made his decision. She tried to pull Kieran away. You don't need to listen to a senile old man. You saw how frightened your mother was. You trust me, don't you? Kieran looked into Victoria's eyes. She was smiling, the smile of a victor hidden beneath a mask of concern, yet something about it unsettled him. Too confident, too eager to keep him from seeing the cameras. Miss Ashford, Raymond said calmly, in a way that was almost frightening. If you're innocent, if what you're saying is true, what do you have to fear from the cameras? Silence. Victoria froze. For a brief instant, Kieran saw something flash in her eyes. Panic. Fear. Then it vanished, replaced by indignation. "I'm not afraid of anything," Victoria snapped. "I just think it's a waste of time when the truth is already clear." Kieran looked at Victoria, then at Raymond, then at his mother curled on the sofa, still whispering Emily's name. Nora's words echoed in his mind. Raymond's warning rang in his ears, and the fleeting panic in Victoria's eyes burned into his thoughts. "Bring the laptop here," Kieran ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'm watching the cameras." Victoria went pale. "Kieran, don't you trust me?" Her voice trembled as tears began to fall again. "I'm your fiancé. I love you." Kieran looked at her, his gray eyes cold as steel. "I trust the truth, Victoria, and cameras don't lie." Raymond nodded and turned to fetch the laptop. As he passed Victoria, he paused for a single moment and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "The truth always finds its way into the light, miss. Always." The security room was located in the basement of the Thorne estate, dark and cold, washed in the pale blue glow of dozens of surveillance screens. Raymond had brought the laptop up to Kieran's study, connected it to the camera system, and rewound the footage from the entire past month, starting from the day Victoria first began staying at the estate. Kieran sat in front of the screen while Victoria stood behind him, her expression struggling to remain composed even as her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles turned white. Raymond stood by the door, watching in silence. Nora was still being held in the waiting room downstairs, waiting for her fate to be decided. Kieran started with the first day Nora arrived for work. The screen showed the young woman in a navy blue uniform, standing outside Margaret's room, her face tense yet resolute. She knocked softly, waited, then entered only after hearing an invitation from inside. Margaret sat on the bed, her eyes empty and distant, not recognizing the young woman who had just come in. Nora didn't rush, didn't force anything. She simply sat on the chair beside the bed, keeping a respectful distance, and began speaking in a gentle voice, like someone soothing a child. Kieran couldn't hear the sound because he'd muted the speakers, but he could see Nora's lips moving, patient and unhurried. 10 minutes passed before Margaret finally looked at her, 20 minutes before she allowed Nora to help her stand. Kieran fast-forwarded to breakfast on the second day. Margaret flung the bowl of porridge to the floor, hot liquid splashing everywhere, some of it staining Nora's uniform. Kieran waited for anger, for frustration, for at least an irritated sigh, but nothing came. Nora simply stood up, wiped the floor clean, wiped Margaret's hands, then returned to the kitchen to bring back a fresh bowl. Not a single complaint, not a single reproachful look. She sat down and began feeding Margaret spoon by spoon as if nothing had happened. The fourth day. Margaret woke at 3 a.m, wandering the dark hallway, calling Emily's name and crying. Nora appeared just minutes later, her hair disheveled from being woken abruptly, yet she showed no irritation. She gently took Margaret's hand, led her back to the room, and sat by her bed all night. The camera captured Nora singing Margaret to sleep, her hand softly stroking the older woman's silver hair until she drifted off. Then Nora leaned down to tuck the blanket around her, her movements tender, as if Margaret were her own mother. Kieran felt a lump rise in his throat. He'd hired 5 nurses in 2 years, and none of them had done this. They worked by the hour, by contract, by obligation. Nora worked with something he couldn't name. The 6th day. Margaret had a terrible day. She didn't recognize anyone, screamed, and smashed whatever was within reach. She slapped Nora across the face when Nora tried to calm her. Kieran clearly saw the red mark bloom on Nora's cheek, yet she showed no anger. She simply stepped back, waited for Margaret's panic to pass, then moved forward and pulled her into an embrace like a frightened child. Margaret cried in Nora's arms for an hour, and Nora stayed there, stroking her back, whispering comfort. Kieran stopped the video. He'd seen enough of the beginning. This wasn't how an abuser behaved. This was how an angel cared for someone she loved. He turned to look at Victoria, and for the first time, he realized something was deeply wrong. "Rewind further," he ordered, his voice colder than before. "I want to see Victoria." Raymond rewound the footage to the 3rd day, a time when Kieran was at the company, and Nora had just gone out to buy medication prescribed by the doctor. Victoria entered Margaret's room, the heels of her shoes striking the wooden floor with a familiar rhythm. The older woman was sitting in the armchair by the window, afternoon sunlight resting on her silver hair, forming a gentle halo around her head. Margaret looked up at Victoria with clouded eyes, struggling to recognize the woman before her. Victoria stepped closer, her face stripped of the false sweetness she wore whenever Kieran was present. In its place was pure disgust, coldness, and contempt. She bent down to Margaret's eye level, her lips moving, and even without sound, Kieran could read every word. "Crazy old hag, you're a burden to all of us." Margaret recoiled, her trembling hand lifting as if to protect herself. But Victoria was faster. She reached out and pinched Margaret's arm, twisting hard. Kieran saw his mother's face contort in pain, her mouth opening in a silent scream on the screen. Victoria released her grip, leaving a dark bruise blooming on the paper-thin skin. She straightened, adjusted her perfect blonde hair as if nothing had happened, then turned on her heel and walked out. Kieran felt his jaw clench until it ached. His hand curled into a fist on the desk, knuckles turning white. But the video didn't stop. Raymond rewound to the 5th day. This time Victoria entered while Margaret was trying to dress herself. The older woman fumbled with the buttons, her shaking fingers unable to guide them through the holes. Victoria stood watching, arms crossed over her chest, her mouth twisting into a mocking smile. Then she stepped forward, yanked the blouse from Margaret's hands with a rough motion that nearly sent the older woman falling. She threw the blouse to the floor, her lips moving with insults Kieran didn't need to hear to understand. Margaret began to cry, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Victoria watched her cry with revulsion, then reached out and pinched her cheek. Not a playful pinch, but one driven by the full force of meticulously manicured fingers, twisting flesh until Margaret's mouth opened in pain. The 7th day. Victoria shoved Margaret down into a chair when she tried to stand, sending her collapsing hard against the cushion. The 9th day. Victoria ripped the phone from Margaret's hand as she tried to call Kieran, threw it to the floor, and crushed the screen beneath her heel. The 11th day. Victoria slapped Margaret when she accidentally spilled water on Victoria's designer dress. The slap was so forceful that the older woman's head snapped to the side, leaving a vivid red mark on her cheek. With each clip, Kieran felt something inside him die. The trust he'd placed in Victoria shattered like broken glass. The love he thought he felt turned to ash. In its place rose a fury that boiled and burned, threatening to consume everything in its path. He turned to look at Victoria. She stood there pale as a corpse, lips trembling as she searched for excuses. "Kieran, I can explain," she stammered, her voice stripped of its former arrogant confidence. "It's not what you think. Your mother, she drives me crazy. She won't listen. I just wanted to teach her." "Shut up," Kieran cut in, his voice icy, holding back a storm on the verge of eruption. "I'm not done yet." He turned back to the screen and nodded at Raymond. "Keep going. I want to see everything." Raymond nodded, his fingers moving over the keyboard. But before advancing the footage, he looked at Victoria with a cold gaze. "I told you already, Miss Ashford. The truth always finds its way into the light. And the darkness you've been hiding," he added as new images began to appear on the screen, "is only just starting to show itself." The video shifted to yesterday. Kieran recognized his mother's bedroom by the afternoon sunlight filtering through the white lace curtains. Margaret was sitting alone on the bed, her eyes clearer than usual, one of those rare moments when Alzheimer's loosened its grip and allowed her awareness to surface. She was holding her old phone, trembling fingers struggling to press the numbers. Kieran recognized the number immediately because it was his own. His heart tightened as he realized that in that rare moment of clarity, his mother was trying to reach him, trying to tell him something. The door burst open. Victoria rushed in, her face changing instantly when she saw the phone in Margaret's hand. She lunged forward and ripped it away with a brutal motion that sent Margaret tipping sideways on the bed. "What are you doing?" Victoria's lips moved, and even without sound, Kieran could feel the fury in every word. "Are you trying to call him? Trying to tattle to your son?" Margaret tried to sit up, her mouth moving, perhaps pleading, perhaps explaining. Victoria gave her no chance. She raised her hand and slapped Margaret across the face. It wasn't a warning slap. It was a full-force blow that snapped the head of the 72-year-old woman to the side and knocked her back onto the bed. Kieran heard something crack inside his chest. He didn't know whether it was his heart breaking or something else, but he knew that from this moment on, nothing could ever return to the way it was. On the screen, Victoria bent down, grabbed Margaret by the hair, and yanked her upright. Her lips moved close to the older woman's tear-streaked face, and Kieran read every word. "Listen here, you crazy old hag. If you dare say a single word to Kieran, I'll put you in a nursing home until you die. You'll rot there alone. No visitors. No one who cares. Your son doesn't have time for you. He's busy with me. He loves me. And you're just a burden he wants to throw away." Margaret cried, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks already flushed from the slap. Her lips formed a name, and Kieran recognized it instantly. Emily. His mother was calling for his sister, seeking comfort from the daughter who had died 11 years earlier. Victoria smiled, a cold and merciless smile. Then she did something that froze the blood in Kieran's veins. She walked to the vanity, picked up a gleaming steel nail scissors, and turned back toward Margaret. She raised the scissors, letting the afternoon light glint off the cold metal. Margaret shrank back, eyes wide with terror, hands lifted to shield her face as if bracing for a fatal blow. Victoria didn't stab her. She simply stood there, holding the scissors in front of the older woman, her lips moving with threats Kieran didn't need to hear to understand. She was savoring Margaret's fear. She was drinking every tear like fine champagne. She was torturing his mother, not with physical violence, but with psychological terror. Finally, Victoria lowered the scissors, set them on the table, and walked out as if nothing had happened. She left Margaret alone, curled on the bed, shaking and sobbing, calling out Emily's name and Kieran's in despair. Kieran stopped the video. He couldn't watch anymore. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the rage boiling through his veins. He turned to look at Victoria. She was crying, tears streaming down her face. But now Kieran saw through them. They weren't tears of remorse. They were the tears of someone caught in the act. The tears of a monster when its angelic mask had been torn away. "Kieran, you have to understand me," Victoria stammered, trying to rush forward and grab his hand. "Your mother, she drives me crazy. She won't listen. I just wanted what was best for you. I love you." Kieran said nothing. He only stared at her with eyes as cold as a frozen hell. And in that gaze, Victoria saw something she had never seen before. Death. Not physical death, but the death of everything she had ever had with him. "There's today's footage as well," Raymond said, breaking the heavy silence. "Do you want to see it, sir?" Kieran nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Victoria. "Play it. I want to know everything." Victoria collapsed into a chair, as if her legs could no longer hold her. She knew it was over. The stage had fallen, and now she had to face the consequences delivered by the man all of Chicago called the Devil. Raymond advanced the footage to this afternoon, just a few hours before Kieran returned home. The screen revealed the familiar living room, bathed in golden sunset light pouring through the massive windows. Margaret was sitting on the sofa, her hand holding a cup of tea Nora had just made for her before going into the kitchen to fetch more cookies. The older woman looked peaceful, her clouded eyes resting on the garden outside with a rare sense of calm. The living room door opened. Victoria stepped in, her blood-red dress blazing beneath the sunset glow. She glanced around to make sure no one else was present, then moved toward Margaret with slow, deliberate steps, like a predator closing in on its prey. Margaret looked up, and fear instantly flooded her eyes as she recognized the woman before her. She shrank back, the teacup trembling in her hand as tea spilled over the rim. Victoria bent down, grabbed Margaret's wrist, and squeezed hard. Her lips moved with words Kieran could now easily imagine were insults and threats. The older woman tried to pull her hand away, but the strength of a 72-year-old couldn't stand against a 32-year-old fueled by cruelty. Victoria pinched Margaret's thigh and twisted viciously, and Kieran saw his mother's face contort in pain. Then the kitchen door opened. Nora stepped into the living room with a plate of cookies in her hands. She froze for a split second at the sight before her. Victoria bent over, fingers digging into Margaret's thigh, the older woman crying and struggling. The plate shattered on the floor. "Let her go." Kieran read the words on Nora's lips, clear and unyielding. Victoria straightened and turned to face Nora, shock and rage twisting her expression. Her lips moved, likely a threat, a warning for Nora to step back. But Nora didn't retreat. She walked straight to Margaret and positioned herself between the older woman and Victoria like a human shield. Kieran watched Nora speak. She was saying she didn't care who Victoria was. She was saying that abusing an elderly person was a crime. She was saying she'd call the police. Victoria completely lost control. Her face warped with fury, the flawless mask she'd worn for so long shattering to reveal the monster beneath. She began screaming, pointing at Nora, advancing with open menace. Nora pulled Margaret tightly into her arms, shielding her with her own body. She didn't tremble, didn't step back, even as Victoria approached with the face of someone ready to kill. Margaret clung to Nora, sobbing, and for the first time in weeks, she found someone willing to protect her. Victoria raised her hand, ready to rip Margaret from Nora's grasp. Nora turned, offering her back to take the blow. fully covering the older woman. And that was when the front door opened. The video captured the moment Kieran stepped inside, frozen beneath the archway, witnessing the scene he'd completely misunderstood. Kieran stopped the video. He'd seen enough. Now he understood why his mother had been so terrified of Victoria. Now he understood why she'd clung to Nora like her only lifeline. Now he understood why she'd called Nora by Emily's name, because in her fractured mind, Nora was the only one protecting her, just as Emily once had. He rose slowly, every movement radiating lethal danger. He turned toward Victoria, and in his gray eyes there was no longer cold restraint. There was hell. There was death waiting. Kieran walked toward Victoria, slowly, each step echoing through the silent room like a funeral drum. He didn't shout, didn't rage, didn't lose control the way Victoria had. His stillness was far more terrifying than any outburst. It was the stillness of a storm before landfall, of the sea before a tsunami, of death itself before the scythe is raised. 32 days, Kieran said, his voice low and even, like a prayer bell for the dead. 32 days you tortured my mother. I counted every single day on the cameras. Victoria stammered, tears still streaming down her face. Kieran, I can explain. It's not what you think. Your mother, she drives me crazy. She won't listen. I just wanted to discipline her so she wouldn't interfere with us. I love you. I did everything for you. Kieran stopped one step away from her. He looked down at her, his gray eyes so cold that Victoria felt as if she were freezing from the inside out. Do you know why people call me the devil? Kieran asked, his voice as light as a passing breeze, yet carrying the weight of hell itself. Victoria shook her head, her trembling lips unable to form words. Because I have no limits when someone touches the people I love, Kieran continued, each word falling like a slab of ice. My sister died. My father died. My mother is the only one left. The only thing in this world I still care about. And you, he paused, letting the silence stretch long enough for terror to crawl up Victoria's spine. You dared to hurt her. You dared to make her cry. You dared to threaten her with scissors. Kieran, please. Victoria collapsed to her knees, clutching his pant leg like a beggar pleading for her life. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But we're about to get married. Your father and my father had an agreement. You can't do this to me. You need me. Your empire needs an alliance with my family. Kieran looked down at the woman kneeling at his feet, and he felt nothing. No pity, no hesitation, only pure, icy disgust. My father is dead, Kieran said, his voice devoid of emotion, and he would want me to protect my mother above any agreement. As for my empire, he bent down, gripping Victoria's chin and forcing her to look into his eyes. I built it with my own blood and bones. I don't need anyone. He released her and shoved her backward onto the floor. Get out of my house, Kieran ordered. You have 5 minutes. The engagement is over. Victoria struggled to her feet, her voice shrill with desperation. You can't do this. Don't you know who my father is? He's a senator. He has power. He'll destroy you. Kieran smiled. But the smile was colder than a Chicago winter. Your father, he said slowly. If you set foot anywhere on my territory again, I'll send every one of these videos to every newspaper in this city. The Senator Ashford's daughter abusing a 72-year-old woman with Alzheimer's. How long do you think his political career will survive? Victoria went pale as a corpse. You wouldn't dare, she whispered. Kieran tilted his head, his gaze sharp as a blade. Try me. Then he stepped closer, his voice dropping into a whisper meant only for her. And if you dare take revenge on anyone in this house, especially the girl named Nora, I won't need videos anymore. I'll use the traditional methods of the Thorne family. Do you understand what those methods are? Victoria trembled, tears and mascara streaking black lines down her face. She understood. All of Chicago understood what the traditional methods of the Thorne family meant. Those who opposed them tended to disappear and were never found again. Take her outside, Kieran ordered the 2 bodyguards at the door, and make sure she never sets foot here again. Victoria was dragged away, her mouth still screaming a mixture of pleas and threats, but Kieran had already turned his back, never looking at her again. To him, Victoria Ashford was dead, not a physical death, but the death of existence. She was nothing to him now. Raymond stepped up beside Kieran, his voice gentle yet concerned. The girl, Nora, is still waiting downstairs. Kieran stood motionless for a moment, staring out the window as darkness slowly swallowed the last of the sunset. He'd made a catastrophic mistake. He'd nearly driven away the only person who had truly protected his mother. "Bring her to me," Kieran said, his voice still cold, yet carrying something Raymond had never heard in it before in all these years. Regret. Nora was sitting in the waiting room downstairs, strangely calm for someone who had just been threatened with destruction by a mafia boss. She sat upright on the hard wooden chair, hands resting on her thighs, eyes fixed straight ahead as if waiting for something inevitable. When Kieran entered, Nora didn't stand, didn't bow her head, didn't show fear. She simply looked up at him with steady green eyes, the gaze of someone who had weathered too many storms in life to be shaken by anything now. Kieran stood at the doorway, for the first time in his life unsure of what to say. He was the man who controlled an entire underworld empire, who issued orders to hundreds, who made all of Chicago bow its head. Yet now, standing before a 27-year-old housekeeper in a wrinkled navy uniform, he felt like a child trying to apologize after doing something unforgivable. Silence stretched between them, heavy as lead. Finally, Kieran stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. He just stood there, facing Nora as if facing a sentence. "I was wrong," Kieran said, his voice rough. Those 3 words weighed like stone on his tongue, because it was the first time in his life he'd ever said them to anyone. "I trusted the wrong person. I almost drove away the only one who truly protected my mother. I'm sorry." Nora looked at him, her eyes unmoved. She didn't look triumphant, didn't look satisfied, didn't show any reaction Kieran had seen in others when they were vindicated. "You're apologizing to me," Nora repeated, her voice as calm as if she were commenting on the weather. Kieran nodded, feeling helpless in a way he never had before. "I know that isn't enough, but I don't know what else to say." Nora stood up slowly and faced him. She was nearly a head shorter, small in her simple uniform, yet the way she stood, the way she met his eyes without a trace of fear, made her seem towering. "I don't need your apology," Nora said, her voice clear and firm. Kieran blinked in surprise. "You don't need it." "No," Nora shook her head. "What I need, what Margaret needs, is for you to care about your mother more." Kieran stood there, unable to speak. No one talked to him like that. No one dared. But Nora continued, her voice steady, without hesitation. "She calls Emily's name every day. Did you know that? She asks when her son is coming home, every single day. She sits by the window, looking outside, waiting. And where are you? At the office, in meetings, anywhere except beside her." Kieran felt as if someone had punched him straight in the chest. "I'm busy," he stammered, a weak excuse he didn't even believe himself. "Work, the Empire, enemies waiting for a chance to bring me down. I can't always be home." Nora looked at him, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Do you think she needs your money? Your expensive dresses? This mansion?" "No, she needs you. She needs her son. And you handed her over to a woman who wanted to kill her because you were too busy to see the truth right in front of you." Kieran had no answer. He had nothing to argue with. Everything Nora said was true. A truth as painful and precise as a knife driven straight into his heart. He had neglected his mother. He had believed money and staff could replace his presence. He'd been wrong, completely wrong. "Will you stay?" Kieran asked, his voice dropping, almost a plea. Nora was silent for a moment, studying the man before her. This was no longer the terrifying mafia boss Chicago feared. This was just a son in pain, realizing he'd failed his mother. "I'll stay," Nora finally said. "But not for you. For Margaret. She needs me, and it seems..." She paused, looking at Kieran with an expression he couldn't decipher. "You need to learn how to be a son before it's too late." Kieran nodded, accepting the judgment. For the first time in his life, he respected someone not because they feared him, but because they dared to speak the truth he needed to hear. That night, after everything had finally settled, Nora sat alone in the small room Raymond had arranged for her to stay in temporarily. She took out her phone and called Sunrise Haven Nursing Home, where her younger brother lived. Ethan answered on the 3rd ring, his voice strained by cerebral palsy yet filled with joy when he heard his sister. "Nora," he said slowly, one word at a time. "Are you okay? Are you sleeping enough? I worry about you so much." Nora smiled, even though Ethan couldn't see it. "I'm okay. Don't worry. The new job is fine. I'll send this month's money on time." After she hung up, Nora sat quietly in the darkness, letting memories she'd tried to bury for years slowly rise like ghosts from the past. She remembered that night, the night her life changed forever. She was only 8 years old, asleep in the small room she shared with her 3-year-old brother when the smell of smoke woke her. Fire had already swallowed the old wooden house, devouring everything in its path. Her parents were in the room across the hall, and when Nora tried to run to them, the ceiling collapsed and blocked the way. She heard her mother scream, calling her name and Ethan's, and then nothing. Nora didn't have time to cry. She ran to Ethan's bed, lifted her small brother into her arms, and ran toward the window. Flames licked her back as she climbed through the burning wooden frame. Pain so intense she nearly dropped Ethan, but she didn't. She held him tight and jumped, rolling across the damp grass to smother the fire on her body. When firefighters arrived, they found 2 children lying on the lawn. An 8-year-old girl still clutching her 3-year-old brother, her back burned black and bleeding. Their parents were never found alive. The scar on Nora's back stretched from her left shoulder to her right hip, a map of pain and loss she would carry for life. Yet every time she looked in the mirror and saw that scar, she didn't feel sorrow. She felt pride, because it was the price of love, and she'd pay it again as many times as it took. After the fire, Nora and Ethan were placed into the foster system. Ethan was diagnosed with cerebral palsy early on and needed special care the system couldn't provide. He was separated from Nora and sent to a cheap nursing facility in the suburbs. Nora, meanwhile, passed through 7 foster families over the next 10 years. The first used her as unpaid help. The second beat her whenever she made a mistake. The third starved her as punishment. The fourth had a father who looked at her in ways that made her lock her bedroom door every night. She learned how to survive, how to hide bruises, how not to cry when she was hit. She learned how to become invisible, because invisible children don't get hurt. When she turned 18, Nora aged out of the system and began working. 3 jobs at once, 7 days a week, to save enough money to move Ethan to a better facility. Sunrise Haven cost $5,000 a month, nearly swallowing every dollar she earned, but Nora didn't complain. Ethan was the only family she had left. She'd do anything for him. Then came the false accusation. 2 years earlier, she worked as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in the Chicago suburbs. The homeowner lost a diamond necklace and blamed Nora. She was arrested and jailed for 2 months while awaiting trial. 2 months without sending money to Ethan. 2 months living in hell among real criminals. When the necklace was found in the daughter's handbag, Nora was released without a single apology. But the arrest record followed her, making it nearly impossible to find work. No one wanted to hire someone who'd been jailed, even if it was a lie. From then on, Nora lived in her broken-down car, parking in public lots, showering at gas stations and cheap gyms. She took any job she could find, washing dishes, cleaning restrooms, anything that paid enough to send Ethan his money on time. When the employment agency called about a caregiver position at the Thorne estate, she had no idea she was stepping into the world of the mafia. She only knew the job paid more than anything she'd ever done. And with that money, maybe for the first time in her life, she could sleep in a real bed. Nora looked down at her calloused hands in the darkness. This is the price of love, she told herself, the same way she had for 19 years. And she'd pay it again as many times as it took. In the days that followed, the Thorne estate began to change in ways no one had expected. Kieran, the most notorious mafia boss in Chicago, the man the entire underworld bowed to, began coming home earlier. At first, it was only an hour or 2, then half a day, then entire days. He set up his office inside the mansion library. The door always left open so he could hear his mother from the living room. Meetings with other bosses were shortened. Business trips were delegated to subordinates. The empire kept running, but now it ran without the constant presence of its owner. On the 15th day, Kieran tried to brush his mother's hair himself. It was a disaster. He pulled too hard, making Margaret cry out in pain and shrink away. Kieran froze, the hand holding the brush trembling, unsure what to do next. He was a man who could order deaths without blinking, yet he was helpless before a brush and his mother's silver hair. Nora appeared in the doorway, not mocking, not smiling. She simply stepped closer, stood behind Kieran, and placed her hand over his, guiding his movements. "Soften your wrist," she said gently, "like you're touching a flower petal, not signing a check." Kieran felt the warmth of Nora's hand travel through his skin, and for the first time in many years, he felt something other than the constant cold inside his chest. He followed her guidance, slowly and carefully, and when the brush passed through Margaret's hair without causing pain, a strange pride rose in his chest. On the 30th day, Margaret had a bad day. She recognized no one, cried, and asked where her mother was. Kieran's grandmother, who had died 20 years earlier. In the past, Kieran would have panicked, would have called the doctor to sedate her. But that day, he did what Nora had taught him. He sat on the floor beside his mother, took her frail hand, and gently followed the current of her delusion instead of fighting it. Grandma went to the market. "Mom," Kieran said, his voice gentle in a way even he didn't recognize. "But she left me here to take care of you." Then he sang the lullaby Nora had taught him, his voice low and slightly off-key from lack of practice. Margaret stopped crying. She looked at her son with clouded eyes, and though she didn't recognize him as Kieran, she felt the safety in that clumsy song. She rested her head on his shoulder and fell asleep, peaceful for the first time in weeks. Nora stood in the doorway, witnessing it all. She said nothing, only smiled softly before turning away. On the 60th day, a miracle happened. Margaret woke that morning with brighter eyes than usual, one of those rare moments when the Alzheimer's fog lifted and revealed the formidable woman she once was. Kieran was sitting beside her bed, reading the newspaper, a new habit he had formed. Margaret looked at her son, and for the first time in 6 months, she called him by his name. "Kieran," she whispered, her voice hoarse but clear. "My son, you look so much like your father." Kieran dropped the newspaper, his heart stumbling in his chest. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "you recognize me." Margaret smiled, her trembling hand lifting to caress her son's face. "You're here more now," she said. "I see you every day. I hear you sing. You sing terribly, but I like it." Kieran laughed, a wet laugh as tears threatened to spill. Then Margaret turned her head toward the doorway, where Nora stood holding a breakfast tray. "That girl," Margaret said to Kieran, her voice suddenly sharp like it had been when she was queen of the underworld. "Keep her. She's good. She makes you a better man." Then the light in her eyes slowly faded. The Alzheimer's fog rolled back in, and Margaret returned to her own blurred world. But Kieran wasn't sad. He had what he needed. His mother had recognized him. He had heard her say she was proud, and he knew that even if illness stole her memories, her love for him was still there, hidden beneath the fog, waiting for those rare moments to shine through. Late one night, about 2 weeks after the day Margaret recognized her son, Kieran couldn't sleep. He stood by the window of his study, looking out at the garden drowned in darkness beneath the cold Chicago moon. That was when he saw it. An old battered car parked in the far corner of the staff lot, and inside it, a curled-up figure slumped in the driver's seat. Kieran frowned and stepped outside in his black coat. As he drew closer, he realized it was Nora, folded in on herself on the seat, a thin blanket offering little protection against the biting chill of the late autumn night. She was asleep, her face pale from the cold, each breath forming faint white clouds in the air. He stood there for a long time, watching the woman who had saved his mother sleep in a car that looked as if it might collapse at any moment. Anger flared in his chest, but not at Nora. He was furious with himself for not seeing this sooner. The next morning, Kieran summoned Raymond to his study. "I want to know everything about her," he said, his voice giving nothing away. "Nora Sullivan, her past, her family, her finances, everything." Raymond nodded and disappeared. 2 days later, he returned with a thick file. Kieran read every page, and with each one, his heart tightened further. The house fire when she was 8 years old. Her parents burned to death. Her carrying her 3-year-old brother out with her back severely burned. 10 years in the foster system. 7 foster families. School records noting repeated instances of bruises on her body. Her brother Ethan, 22 years old, born with cerebral palsy, living at Sunrise Haven with a monthly cost of $5,000. The false accusation 2 years earlier, 2 months in jail for a crime she didn't commit. And now, no permanent address, no meaningful bank account. Nearly all her income transferred directly to her brother's care facility. Kieran closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. He'd met many people in his life. Killers, criminals, traitors. But he'd never met anyone like Nora Sullivan. Someone who had endured a living hell and still kept a kind heart. Someone willing to sleep in a car so her brother could live better. Someone who protected his mother knowing it could cost her job or worse. That afternoon, Kieran called Nora into his study. She entered with her usual calm expression, but he noticed the fatigue hidden behind her green eyes, the dark circles she couldn't fully conceal. "Sit down," Kieran said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Nora sat, back straight, hands resting on her thighs. She thought she was about to be fired. He could read that in her eyes. But she didn't tremble, didn't beg. She simply waited, calm as someone bracing for a storm she knew was coming. Kieran slid a stack of papers toward her. "This is a new contract," he said. "Triple your current salary. A room in the mansion, next to my mother's. Full medical insurance for you and your brother." Nora froze, her eyes widening as she stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "You know about Ethan," she whispered. "I know everything," Kieran replied evenly. "I know you've been sleeping in your car in the parking lot. I know you send almost all your pay to your brother. I know what you've endured for the past 19 years. Nora stayed silent, her hands clenched together on her lap, and Kieran realized it was the first time he'd seen her lose her composure. "I don't need pity," Nora finally said, her voice hardening. Kieran tilted his head slightly, one corner of his mouth lifting. "Do you think I know pity? I'm the devil, remember?" Nora looked at him, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in those cold gray eyes. "Not cruelty, not contempt, respect. This is an investment," Kieran continued. "You're the only person who brings peace to my mother. I need you healthy to care for her. I need you free from worries about money or shelter so you can focus on your work. This isn't charity. This is business." Nora was silent for a long moment, staring down at the contract. Then she looked up, green eyes meeting gray. "All right," she said. "For Margaret." Kieran nodded. But as Nora stood and walked toward the door, he added something that made her stop. "And for yourself too, Nora. Even if you don't want to admit it." Nora didn't turn back, but Kieran saw her shoulders tremble slightly. Then she walked on, leaving him alone in the study, watching her go with a feeling he couldn't name. 1 month after being thrown out of the Thorne estate, Victoria Ashford sat inside a cheap rented apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, a world away from the luxury she once lived in. Her father, Senator Ashford, had cut off all ties with her after Kieran sent a copy of the video footage to his office as a warning. Her friends vanished as if they'd never existed. Her credit cards were frozen. Her reputation dissolved into nothing. Victoria had lost everything, and she knew exactly who was responsible. Not Kieran, but that cursed little housekeeper, Nora Sullivan. She had taken everything from Victoria, and Victoria would make her pay, even if it was the last thing she ever did. Victoria picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd kept secret for years. A direct line to the Mendoza cartel, the largest drug empire rivaling the Thorne family. She'd once served as a covert intermediary between her father and the cartel, using the connection to gather information she planned to use to control Kieran after marriage. Now she'd use it for something else. "I have information on Kieran Thorne," Victoria said when the call connected. "His weakness. A way to destroy him without direct confrontation." There was silence on the other end. Then a low male voice replied, "We're listening, Miss Ashford." Victoria smiled, her first smile since the day she'd been expelled from the estate. "His mother," she said slowly, savoring every word. "Margaret Thorne. She has advanced Alzheimer's, can't defend herself, can't recognize anyone. He loves her more than anything in the world. And there's a housekeeper, Nora Sullivan. He's started to care about her too. If you want to hurt Kieran Thorne, target those two." The call ended without goodbye. Victoria set the phone down and stared out the window, her eyes burning with hatred. Now all she had to do was wait. 2 weeks later, on a stormy night, Kieran was downtown in an emergency meeting with other bosses when his phone vibrated, Raymond's number. Kieran answered, and what he heard froze the blood in his veins. "The estate is under attack. The perimeter guards were neutralized because Victoria's maps gave them our security blind spots." Raymond gasped, gunfire echoing behind him. 3 elite hitmen have breached the inner sanctum. They're looking for Mrs. Margaret. I'm wounded. I can't move. Nora and Mrs. Margaret are upstairs. Kieran said nothing. He stood up, flipped the meeting table, and stormed out like a force of nature. He jumped into his car and floored the accelerator, ignoring red lights and speed limits. There was only one thought in his mind. Mom, Nora, no, no, no. Meanwhile, at the Thorne estate, Nora heard gunshots erupt from downstairs. She'd been reading to Margaret when the deadly sound tore through the quiet of the late night. Survival instincts sharpened by 19 years of hell snapped into place. She didn't panic, didn't scream, didn't freeze. She moved. Nora pulled Margaret up, supporting the trembling, terrified older woman, guiding her toward the safe room Kieran had shown her. But when they reached it, the steel door was jammed and wouldn't open. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, closing in. Nora scanned the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hand grabbed a heavy brass lamp base by the door. She shoved Margaret into the corner, shielding her with her own body, and turned to face the doorway. "Emily," Margaret whispered, her frail hand clutching Nora's shirt. She was terrified. "Don't be afraid," Nora said, her voice calm even as her heart pounded like war drums. "I'll protect you. I promise." The door burst open. A large, dark figure appeared, a gun in his hand. He saw Margaret cowering in the corner and grinned, moving toward her with the look of a predator closing in on prey. He didn't spare Nora a glance, because to him, the small woman in a Navy uniform wasn't a threat. It was the biggest and final mistake of his life. As he passed Nora to reach Margaret, she swung the lamp base with all her strength, smashing it into his temple. He went down like a felled tree, his gun skidding across the floor. But 2 more men appeared in the doorway. Nora didn't retreat. She stood in front of Margaret like a fortress, the lamp base slick with blood in her hand, green eyes blazing with a fire no one would have expected from someone so slight. The second attacker charged, and Nora fought. She fought like a cornered animal, like a mother defending her child, like an angel standing in hell. She was punched in the face, kicked in the stomach, but she didn't fall. She kept striking back, kept swinging the lamp base, kept protecting Margaret even as blood streamed from wounds on her forehead and arms. And that was when Kieran arrived. He stormed into the estate with his gun drawn, taking down the third man as he tried to reach the stairs. He raced upstairs, his heart slamming in his chest, praying to any god who might be listening that he wasn't too late. When he reached the doorway, he froze. Nora stood there, clothes torn and bloodied, the lamp base still in her grip, 2 attackers lying motionless at her feet, and behind her, Margaret crouched in the corner, crying but unharmed. That fragile woman, alone, had protected his mother from 3 professional killers. Kieran looked at Nora, and in that moment, something inside him changed forever. Kieran stood there as if turned to stone, the gun lowering in his hand, his gray eyes unable to tear themselves away from the sight before him. Nora, the fragile woman he had once thought only knew how to care for the sick and sing lullabies, was standing amid the wreckage like a goddess of war. Blood ran from a wound on her forehead, staining one side of her face red. Her left arm was split by a long gash, blood dripping onto the wooden floor. Her Navy uniform was torn and soaked. Impossible to tell whether the blood was hers or the attacker's. Yet she remained upright, solid as a mountain, the lamp base still in her grip, ready to fight again if needed. "Nora," Kieran whispered, his voice rough with a feeling he couldn't name. Nora turned to look at him, and only then, when she knew Margaret was safe, did her legs begin to tremble. The lamp base fell to the floor with a clang, and Nora would have collapsed with it if Kieran hadn't rushed forward to catch her. He held her, his arms wrapped around her shaking frame, and for the first time in his life, the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago didn't know what to say to comfort someone. "She isn't hurt," Nora whispered, her voice weak but still trying to report. "I protected her. I promised." "I know," Kieran said, holding her tighter. "You did. You saved my mother." Margaret crawled out from the corner, her eyes still panicked but no longer afraid when she saw her son. She came toward Kieran and Nora, her trembling hand touching the back of the girl held in her son's arms. "Emily," she whispered, calling Nora by the name she always used. "Emily, you were so brave. You hit the bad men. You protected Mom." Kieran closed his eyes, feeling tears threatening to spill even though he hadn't cried since the day the real Emily died. The Thorne family's private medical team arrived within 15 minutes. Raymond had been shot in the shoulder, but his life wasn't in danger. He'd held the attackers off downstairs long enough for Nora to act. 3 assassins, 2 dead, 1 unconscious and soon to be interrogated. Kieran lifted Nora into his arms, not caring that blood was soaking into his expensive suit. She protested weakly, saying she could walk, but he didn't listen. He carried her downstairs, laid her on the bed in the estate's medical room, and stood there watching as the doctor stitched her wounds. He didn't leave for even a second. His mother was taken to the adjacent room to be examined, and was unharmed aside from shock. And even in her panic, she kept asking where Emily was, whether Emily was in pain. When the doctor finished bandaging Nora and left, Kieran pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed. She lay there with her eyes closed from exhaustion, but she wasn't asleep. He knew, because her lashes still fluttered faintly. "Why?" Kieran asked, his voice soft as the night air. "Why didn't you run? You could have left my mother and saved yourself. No one would have blamed you." Nora opened her eyes, green and tired, yet still burning with a fire Kieran now knew would never fade. "Because she's my family," Nora said, her voice hoarse but firm. "I lost my parents. I can't lose anyone else." Kieran looked at her, and in that moment he understood a truth he'd been denying for weeks. Nora Sullivan wasn't just his mother's caregiver. She had become an irreplaceable part of his life. She had taught him how to love his mother. She had made this cold mansion warm. And now, she had nearly died to protect the person he loved most in the world. "Thank you," Kieran whispered, and the words weighed more than anything he'd ever spoken. "Thank you for not abandoning my mother. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for surviving." Nora didn't answer with words. She simply lifted her bandaged hand, and Kieran took it, holding on as if afraid that if he let go, she would vanish like smoke. They sat there in silence through the night, 2 hands clasped, 2 hearts slowly healing wounds no one else could see. 3 days after the attack, Nora was still lying in the private medical room of the Thorne estate. The wound on her forehead had been neatly stitched, her left arm carefully bandaged, but the doctor said she needed to rest for at least a week before she could return to work. Kieran barely left her room, stepping out only when he had to check on his mother or handle urgent matters related to the attack. That afternoon, the doctor came to change Nora's bandages. Kieran was about to step outside to give her privacy, but Nora asked him to stay because she didn't want to be alone with a stranger after everything that had happened. He nodded and turned his face away while the doctor worked. But when the doctor asked Nora to lie on her side to check the bruising on her back, Kieran saw it by accident. The scar. A massive scar running from her left shoulder down to her right hip, the skin twisted and discolored. Undeniable proof of a severe burn that had healed long ago. Kieran froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had read Nora's file. He knew about the house fire. But seeing the scar with his own eyes was something else entirely. It was real. It was horrifying, and it told the story of an 8-year-old girl who had run through fire to save her little brother. After the doctor left, silence settled over the room. Nora lay on her side with her back to Kieran, knowing he had seen it. She wasn't ashamed of the scar, but she wasn't used to letting anyone see it either. This was the first time anyone other than a doctor had seen her back since she left the foster system. "The fire," Kieran said at last, his voice low and gentle, in a way he didn't even recognize. "You ran through the flames." Nora slowly sat up, pulled her shirt down to cover her back, then turned to face him. Her green eyes held no shame or self-pity, only the calm of someone who had long accepted her past. "The bedroom window," Nora said evenly, as if telling someone else's story. "The fire blocked the main exit. Ethan was only 3. He couldn't run on his own. I picked him up and climbed through the window. The wooden frame was burning. The flames licked my back as I went through." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I almost dropped him because it hurt so badly, but I didn't. If I had, he would have died, and I'd already lost my parents. I couldn't lose Ethan too." Kieran sat down beside her, closer than he had ever been. He didn't speak for a long moment, just looked at her with gray eyes stripped of their usual coldness. "Emily," he finally said, the name heavy on his tongue. "My sister. She was 19 when she died." Nora looked up at him, waiting. Kieran had never spoken about Emily to anyone, not even to Victoria when they were engaged. But with Nora, the woman who had nearly died to protect his mother, he felt she deserved to know. "There was a hit," Kieran continued, his voice rough. "I was 25, had taken over the empire from my father only 3 years earlier. Emily came with me to a meeting she never should have attended. She insisted, said she wanted to learn how to run the family. I should have said no. I should have protected her." He stopped, jaw clenched tight. "They shot her right in front of me. I held her in my arms, watched her bleed to death, and I couldn't do anything. She kept calling my name, Kieran, until the very end." He closed his eyes as the memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. "I became the devil after that night," he went on, "because if I wasn't terrifying enough, I couldn't protect anyone. If I wasn't ruthless, more people I loved would die. I built an empire out of blood and bone so no one would ever dare touch my family again. And then I realized I'd been so busy protecting my mother from enemies outside that I forgot the enemy could be standing right beside her." Silence filled the room, but it wasn't heavy. It was the silence of 2 people who had seen each other's souls, who had shared their deepest wounds, and who found comfort in knowing they weren't alone. "You're not a devil," Nora said softly at last. "You're just someone who's been hurt too much." Kieran looked at her, and in his eyes, Nora saw something she'd never seen before. Fragility, truth, and maybe a spark of hope. He reached out and gently touched the scar on her forehead where the new wound was healing. "You too," he whispered. "You've been hurt too much. But you're still good. You still kept your heart. Teach me how to do that, Nora." Nora didn't answer with words. She simply placed her hand over his, letting their scars touch, hers from fire, his from war. And in that moment, two broken souls found each other in the dark. 1 week after the attack, Kieran uncovered everything he needed to know. The surviving assassin confessed after only a few hours of questioning using the traditional methods of the Thorne family. Victoria Ashford, she was the one who contacted the Mendoza cartel, supplied information about Margaret and Nora, drew maps of the estate, and detailed the daily schedules of everyone inside. She sold his mother's life to satisfy her thirst for revenge. Kieran wasn't surprised. He had suspected Victoria from the moment he realized how flawlessly the attack had been planned. But suspicion was one thing, proof was another. Now he had it, and he could act without explaining himself to anyone. He didn't kill Victoria, not because he felt mercy for her, but because Nora asked him not to. "Margaret wouldn't want to see you stained with blood because of her," Nora said when Kieran asked for her thoughts. "She's seen enough violence in her life. Let justice come another way." Kieran listened, and he chose a punishment more brutal than death. On a Monday morning, every video of Victoria abusing Margaret was sent to every major newspaper in Chicago, every local television station, every influential social media outlet. Headlines flooded the city. Senator Ashford's daughter abuses a 72-year-old Alzheimer's patient. The footage ignited outrage across Chicago. Victoria Ashford, once celebrated as a symbol of the city's elite, was now shunned by society. Friends blocked her number. Exclusive clubs erased her name from their membership lists. Charities she once championed publicly severed all ties. Senator Ashford was forced to resign after the scandal erupted, his 40-year political career dissolving overnight. He publicly disowned his daughter in a desperate attempt to salvage what little honor remained of the family name. Victoria lost everything. Not physical death, but social death. She became a prisoner inside the very home she once considered a fortress, too terrified to step outside for fear of being recognized and spat on. 3 days after the videos were leaked, Kieran's phone rang, Victoria's number. He answered, not because he wanted to hear her voice, but because he wanted to savor the moment. "Kieran," Victoria's voice came through, hoarse and desperate like the cry of a dying animal. "Please, I know I was wrong. I've lost everything. My father disowned me. My friends abandoned me. I have no one left. Please, take the videos down. I'll disappear. I'll never show my face to you again. I'm begging you." Kieran stayed silent for a long moment, letting Victoria drown in the fragile hope that he might relent. Then he spoke, his voice as cold as a Chicago winter. "You pinched my mother. You slapped her. You threatened her with scissors. You called her a burden. You made her cry every night in fear. Then you sold information to the Mendoza cartel. You almost got my mother killed. You almost got Nora killed. And you think an apology is enough." "Kieran, please," Victoria sobbed, her crying sounding like the moans of someone sinking into hell. "I'll do anything. Anything you want. I'm not killing you," Kieran said evenly, as if discussing the weather, "because Nora asked me not to. She said my mother wouldn't want me stained with blood because of her. So you get to live, but you'll live in the hell you created with your own hands. You reap what you sow, Victoria, and you sowed cruelty into fertile ground. You can't expect flowers in return." He ended the call without waiting for her to speak again. Then he deleted her number from his phone, erased her from his life as if she had never existed. Victoria Ashford was dead, not in body, but in soul. And to Kieran, that was the most fitting punishment for someone who dared to touch the people he loved. 6 months after the attack, the Thorne estate had changed so completely it was almost unrecognizable. The cold marble statues in the garden had been replaced by beds of wildflowers bursting with color. A small garden of tomatoes, basil, and fragrant herbs had taken root in one corner of the yard, where Margaret liked to sit in the sun each morning. The old fountain had been repaired, now murmuring cheerfully day and night, like the laughter of a living home. Inside the mansion, the sharp and severe furnishings were gone. In their place were soft sofas, cushions in warm colors, and non-slip rugs so Margaret could walk safely. Fresh flowers filled every room. Gentle music drifted through the living room each afternoon. And most importantly, there was laughter. Today was Margaret's 73rd birthday. There were no 300 guests like in years past when she had still been the queen of the underworld. No press, no politicians, no flatterers seeking favor from the Thorn name. Just one long table beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree in the garden, decorated with wildflowers and scented candles. Margaret sat at the head of the table in the custom wheelchair Kieran had ordered for her, soft and comfortable. She wore a cream linen dress and a straw hat with a blue ribbon Nora had chosen for her that morning. She didn't speak much. Alzheimer's still cast its fog over her mind most of the time, but her eyes were bright and curious, taking in everything around her with the wonder of a child. Most important of all, there was no fear left in those eyes. The terror Victoria had planted in her soul had faded over 6 months of being loved and protected. Kieran sat to his mother's right, pouring lemonade for her with his own hands. He had changed. No more severe black suits at home. Today he wore a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up and comfortable khaki pants. His beard was no longer perfectly groomed but left more natural, and the tension lines around his eyes were gone, replaced by the lines of a smile. To Margaret's left sat Nora, no longer in uniform. Today she wore a simple but beautiful pale yellow floral dress, her hair loose instead of tightly tied back. She looked younger, lighter, as if the weight she had carried for 19 years had finally been set down. But what made today truly special wasn't only the transformation of the house or its people. At the other end of the table sat a young man in a wheelchair, gentle-faced with green eyes identical to Nora's, smiling brightly, even though speaking was still difficult for him. Ethan Sullivan, 22 years old, was meeting his sister outside the walls of a nursing home for the first time. Kieran had arranged everything in secret. He had transferred Ethan to the best care facility in Chicago, with the most advanced medical staff and equipment, and today, he had brought Ethan to the estate to celebrate Margaret's birthday, to see his sister, to sit at a real family table for the first time in his life. When Nora saw her brother being wheeled into the garden that morning, she cried, not from pain, but from the release of someone who had fought alone for years and was finally allowed to rest. She held Ethan for a long time, and he cried too, stammering her name in overwhelming happiness. Raymond was there as well, his shoulder fully healed. He sat beside Ethan, helping him cut his food and lift his glass, caring for him like a grandson of his own. The celebration unfolded with warm conversation and laughter. Margaret didn't remember it was her birthday, but she felt the joy surrounding her. She smiled more than she had on any day in the past 6 months, and sometimes she reached for Nora's hand or touched Kieran's face with pure affection. When the birthday cake was brought out, 73 candles glowing in the evening light, Kieran stood and tapped his glass gently for attention. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his voice warm in a way Raymond had never heard in 30 years of knowing him. "My mother can't say much today, but I know she's happy. I can see it in the way she's gripping her napkin." Soft laughter moved around the table. Kieran looked at Nora, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. "And I want to take this moment to say something. 6 months ago, I almost lost my mother. I almost lost everything. But someone didn't let that happen. Someone who fought when she could have run. Someone who taught me how to love my mother the right way. Someone who turned this cold house into a real family." He raised his glass. "Happy birthday, Mom. And thank you, Nora, for everything." Glasses were lifted, their gentle clink filling the warm afternoon air. Ethan tried to speak, his voice slow but full of feeling. "Thank you," he said carefully, looking at Kieran, "for taking care of my sister." And Margaret, in one of her rare moments of clarity, looked around the table with shining eyes. "My daughter," she said to Nora, her voice trembling but clear, "thank you for bringing my son home." After the birthday cake was cut and everyone had finished eating, Kieran stood up once more. This time, he was holding a thick brown envelope that no one had noticed he'd brought with him. He stepped beside Nora and faced her, his expression serious, but his eyes gentle in a way she'd never seen before. "I have a special gift," Kieran said, his voice carrying clearly enough for everyone at the table to hear. "Not for my mother, but for the person who gave my mother back to me." Nora shook her head, her cheeks warming with embarrassment under everyone's attention. "Mr. Kieran, you don't need to do this. You've already done too much. You moved Ethan to the best facility. You gave me a room in the estate. I don't need anything else." Kieran smiled, a rare smile seen only by those closest to him. "You always say that," he replied. "You always think you don't deserve to receive. But today, you will, because this isn't pity or charity. This is fairness." He placed the envelope in Nora's hands. "Open it." Nora looked at him for a long moment, then slowly opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a stack of legal documents, and when she read the first line, her green eyes widened in shock. It was a house deed, a small home in a quiet neighborhood near Ethan's care facility. Along with it were photographs showing the house fully renovated with a new roof, freshly painted walls, safe electrical wiring, and large windows that let sunlight pour in. There was even a small ramp at the front entrance, so Ethan's wheelchair could move easily. "I've had this house renovated for the past 3 months," Kieran explained. "It's yours, fully paid, no debt. And there's more." He pointed to the next document in the stack. "I've set up a trust fund in your name, enough for you to finish the nursing program you were forced to abandon. Enough for Ethan to be cared for life so you don't have to work 3 jobs at once anymore. Enough for you to live without worrying about tomorrow." Nora raised a hand to her mouth as tears spilled freely. She hadn't cried when she was falsely fired. She hadn't cried when she fought 3 assassins. But now, standing before the kindness of the man she once believed was a devil, she cried like a child. "Kieran," she whispered, calling him by his name for the first time. "This is too much. I can't accept it." "This isn't repayment," Kieran said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is an investment. Because when you graduate, you'll be one of the best nurses in this country. And because I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're family." He paused, looking straight into her eyes with a sincerity he'd never shown anyone before. "And family takes care of each other." From the far end of the table, Ethan tried to clap, his movements still awkward from cerebral palsy. Raymond clapped too, the old man's smile bright as sunlight. But what made the moment perfect was Margaret, the elderly woman, who had been lost in the fog of Alzheimer's all afternoon, suddenly lifted her head, her eyes unusually bright, one of those rare and precious moments of clarity. She reached out with her trembling hand, touched Nora's arm, and gently pulled her closer. "My daughter," Margaret whispered, her voice rough but clearer than it had been in a long time. "Thank you. Thank you for not abandoning me. Thank you for bringing my son home." Then she turned to Kieran, her eyes shimmering with tears. "My son," she said, "you're like your father, but you have your mother's heart. I'm proud of you. I'm so proud of you." Kieran knelt beside her, taking her fragile hand in his. He couldn't speak, only nod, his throat tight. These were the words he'd waited for years, the words he believed Alzheimer's had taken forever. But today, in the golden sunset by Lake Michigan, his mother remembered. She saw him. She was proud of him. Slowly, the light faded from Margaret's eyes, the fog returned, and she drifted into sleep right there in her wheelchair, a peaceful smile on her lips. Kieran stood, gently draping a blanket over her. He looked at Nora, still holding the documents with tears on her cheeks. "She'll be all right," Nora said softly. "She's happy." "I know," Kieran replied. "Because you're here." That evening, after Ethan was taken back to his care facility and Raymond retired for the night, Kieran and Nora sat side by side on the porch, watching the last light of day sink into Lake Michigan. Margaret slept inside, her breathing steady and calm for the first time in years. Silence settled around them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the silence of peace, of 2 people who had weathered the storm together and found safe harbor. "You know," Kieran said, still gazing at the lake, "you're the first person who wasn't afraid of me." Nora smiled softly. "I've lived through things far scarier than you." Kieran turned to her, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "I know. That's why you're different. That's why I want you to stay. Not because of my mother, but because of me." Nora didn't answer with words. She placed her hand over his, letting their scars touch. Both hands bore the marks of painful pasts, hers from fire, his from war. But now, they intertwined, finding warmth in the darkness. They sat there until the first stars appeared in the Chicago sky. 2 broken souls who had found each other, healed each other, and built a family from the ashes of the past. The devil learned how to love. The angel found a place to belong. And in a mansion once as cold as winter, there was now laughter, fresh flowers, and love. This story teaches us that money can buy a house, but only love can build a home. That true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the people willing to stand beside us when the storm hits. That sometimes angels don't have wings. They're just ordinary people with extraordinary hearts, willing to sacrifice themselves to protect the ones they love. And that it's never too late to change, to become better, to learn how to love the right way. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it with the people you love. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our daily heartfelt stories. We'd love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever met someone like Nora in your life? Have you ever had to fight to protect someone you love? Share with us in the comments below, because we always want to hear what's in your heart. Every story you share is precious and may inspire thousands of others. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. We wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and days filled with love. Remember, no matter how hard life gets, there's always light waiting at the end of the tunnel. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.